The Galactic Survival Academy on the frozen moon of Varith Co. had stood for 2,000 standard cycles, and in all that time, it had never once turned away a species that wanted to learn how to stay alive in the worst places the galaxy had to offer. Until the humans applied. Instructor Vorshan stood at the wide observation window of his office and watched the transport shuttle grow larger against the pale sky. His 8 limbs folded behind his back in the Kethvari posture of deep unease, though he would never have admitted that to anyone who asked. He was the head of survival doctrine, a veteran of 30 cycles of training cadets from over 400 worlds, a soldier who had walked through plasma storms on the acid flats of Gorvan and faced apex predators on moons that had no names because nobody survived long enough to name them. He was not the kind of being who felt fear, and yet his stomachs had not stopped churning since Liaison Officer Tivan had placed the biological files of the 6 incoming human cadets on his desk 3 days ago. Tivan stood behind him now, her feathered crest flattened tight against her skull in the Celestia expression of controlled anxiety, her taloned fingers clutching her data tablet like it was the only solid thing left in the universe. "You read the full planetary assessment," she said, and it was not a question. "I read it," Vorshan replied, without turning from the window. "And the biological profiles. I read those as well." Tivan let out a slow hiss through her narrow beak, which was what her species did, instead of sighing. "Then you understand why 14 council members voted against admitting them." Vorshan finally turned from the window and looked down at her, because he was nearly 3 meters tall, and she barely reached his second set of shoulders. "What I understand," he said quietly, "is that their planet is classified as a Category 12 Death World, and that is the highest classification we have, and that we invented that classification specifically because of their planet." Tivan nodded once. "What I also understand," Vorshan continued, "is that they did not just survive on that world, they conquered it, every part of it, the frozen poles, and the boiling deserts and the deep oceans, and the mountain peaks where the air is too thin for most of our cadets to remain conscious for longer than 90 seconds. Yes. And what I understand most of all is that they did this without natural armor, without venom, without claws worth mentioning, without any of the biological advantages that every other Deathworld species possesses." Tivan's crest rose slightly, which meant she was afraid, but also impressed, and she said, "The vote passed by a single margin, instructor, 1 single vote, and I want you to know that the council member who cast the deciding vote told me privately that she did it because she believed it was better to have humans where we could watch them than to leave them out where we could not." Vorshan made a sound deep in his throat that could have been a laugh or could have been a growl. "Wise," he said. The transport shuttle landed on the platform below with a gentle hiss of decompression, and Vorshan watched the main hatch open and the 6 humans walk out into the cold air of Varith Co. They were small. That was the first thing he noticed, and it unsettled him more than he expected, because everything in their files suggested they should be enormous, monstrous, armored things with muscles like starship cables. But instead, they were just small, soft creatures wrapped in standard-issue Academy thermal suits, and they were smiling. The one in front was a woman, compact and dark-skinned, with short-cropped hair, and she walked with the easy rolling gait of someone who was comfortable in her own body, no matter where that body happened to be. And Vorshan knew from her file that her name was Sergeant Mara Okafor, and that she had once walked for 11 straight days across a desert on Earth after a vehicle failure with 2 broken ribs and a liter of water, and that she had arrived at the nearest settlement and asked for a glass of something cold to drink before she collapsed. Behind her came 5 others, 3 men and 2 women, and they moved together with the casual coordination of a pack, not marching, not in formation, just moving the way water moves through a channel, naturally and without effort. adjusting to each other without looking or speaking. Other cadets had gathered at the edges of the landing platform to watch, and Vorshan saw the reactions ripple through them like a wave. The insectoid Vrith cadets pulling their wings tight against their bodies, the crystalline Holovan dimming their inner light, the aquatic Nesseri drawing back toward the moisture stations, responding to something they could not name, something deep and old and instinctive that whispered to them from the back of their brains. Prey recognized predators, even when the predators were smiling. Okafor looked up at the observation window where Vorshan stood, and she gave a small wave, relaxed and friendly, the kind of wave you might give to a neighbor, and Vorshan felt a chill move through all four of his hearts. "She is not what I expected," Tivan said softly. "No," Vorshan agreed. "She is worse, because I expected something I could look at and understand, something that would make sense, something with teeth or claws or bulk. But instead she looks like someone you would invite to share a meal, and that is exactly what makes her dangerous." Tivan tilted her feathered head and asked, "What do you mean?" Vorshan pulled up Earth's planetary file on the wall display behind his desk, the full file, the one that was over 9,000 pages long, and that read like a horror novel written by a deranged god, full of supervolcanoes and ice ages and mass extinctions and plagues and predators and parasites and radiation, and a moon that pulled the oceans back and forth across the surface like a toy. He scrolled to the section on human evolution, past the diagrams of their absurdly efficient cooling systems, and their bizarre ability to heal from wounds that would kill most galactic species 3 times over, and their skeletal structure that could absorb impacts that would shatter Holovan crystal, and their muscles that could keep moving long past the point where their own bodies were destroying themselves from the effort. He stopped on a single line in the summary, highlighted it, and turned to Tivan. "They evolved alongside everything on that planet that was trying to kill them," he said, and his voice was very quiet. "And they won, Tivan. They won against all of it. Every predator, every disease, every disaster, every extinction event, they won, and now they are here, in my academy, and they are smiling at us." Tivan stared at the highlighted text for a long moment, and then looked out the window at the 6 small figures crossing the landing platform, laughing among themselves about something, surrounded by aliens who were instinctively afraid of them, apparently unaware of it, or perhaps simply used to it. "What do we do?" she asked. Vorshan turned off the display and squared all 8 of his shoulders. "We teach them," he said, "and we pray to whatever gods still listen that they continue to find us friendly." Below, Sergeant Mara Okafor stepped through the Academy's main doors, looked around at the towering architecture built for species twice her size, and smiled the easy, comfortable smile of a woman who had never once in her entire life entered a room she did not believe she could walk back out of alive. The Academy's standardized intake testing had been refined over 2,000 cycles to be the most accurate biological and psychological assessment system in the known galaxy. And it had been used to evaluate cadets from over 400 species, and it had never once failed to produce a meaningful result. Until the humans sat down to take it. The testing began on the 2nd morning after the human cohort's arrival, in the vast underground evaluation complex beneath the Academy's main campus, where the air was kept at galactic standard temperature, and the lights were tuned to a neutral spectrum that would not advantage or disadvantage any known species. Vorshan watched from the observation gallery above, all 8 of his limbs gripping the railing, his 4 eyes fixed on the monitors that displayed the biological readouts of every cadet on the testing floor. The first evaluation was the endurance run. The rules were simple. Cadets moved continuously, across rough terrain at whatever pace they could sustain, and they kept moving until their bodies failed, and the medical staff recorded the time and distance before extracting them. The Vrith cadets, with their light insectoid frames, managed between 15 and 25 minutes before their wing muscles began to seize. The Holovan lasted nearly 40 minutes before their crystalline structures began to overheat. The Nesseri pushed past an hour by keeping their skin moist with spray bottles, but eventually their amphibious lungs could not keep up with the oxygen demand. And two Kefvari cadets, the largest and strongest species in the cohort, made it to just over 2 hours before their massive bodies simply ran out of fuel. These were all normal results, well within the expected ranges that the Academy had established over centuries of data. Then the humans began to run. They did not sprint. They did not push. They simply settled into a steady, rolling pace. That looked almost lazy. And they ran. And they kept running. And they talked to each other while they ran, casually, about food and weather and a game called football that Vorshan could not understand, no matter how many times the translation software tried to explain it. At the 1 hour mark, the monitoring technicians noted that the humans showed no signs of fatigue. At the 2 hour mark, when the last non-human cadet had already been extracted, the humans were still talking. At the 4 hour mark, the senior medical officer on duty sent a message to Vorshan, asking if the equipment was malfunctioning, because the readouts indicated that the humans were actually becoming more efficient the longer they ran, as if their bodies were settling into the effort, rather than being destroyed by it. At the 6 hour mark, Vorshan ordered the test stopped, not because the humans were struggling, but because 3 members of the medical staff had filed formal complaints that the monitoring instruments must be broken, and 1 technician had simply left the room without explanation. Sergeant Okafor slowed to a walk and stretched her arms above her head, and asked if there was somewhere to get water. And when a trembling Vrith technician handed her a canteen, she thanked him warmly and drank, and said that had been a nice warm-up. The second evaluation was the toxicity panel. Cadets were brought into a sterile lab and presented with a table of common galactic substances, some harmless and some lethal, and they were asked to identify which ones would kill them and which ones were safe. Okafor walked along the table, picking up containers and reading labels, and she stopped at a sealed vial of capsaicin concentrate, which was classified by the Academy as a Class 3 chemical weapon capable of causing severe tissue damage to most known species. And she held it up and said to the testing officer, a horrified Nesseri named Droom, "This on their food." Droom asked her to repeat that. Okafor explained that on Earth there was an entire culture around eating food that contained this substance in increasing concentrations, that humans competed to eat the most painful food, that they cried and sweated and suffered, and then asked for more, and that this was considered entertainment. Droom set down his datapad. Then Okafor picked up a container of ethanol, which the Academy used as a surgical sterilizing agent, and which was classified as a Category 2 metabolic toxin for most galactic species. And she told Droom that humans drank this recreationally, that they mixed it with fruit juice and sugar, and consumed it at social gatherings, specifically to impair their own cognitive function, and that they called this fun. Droom excused himself and did not return. The third evaluation was the pain response assessment. A standard neural stimulation device was attached to each cadet's dominant limb, and mild electrical impulses were delivered in increasing increments on a scale from 1 to 50, and cadets were instructed to indicate when the pain became unbearable. Most species tapped out between levels 8 and 15. The Kethvari with their thick hides lasted until level 22. And the Academy record across all species and all time was level 31, held by a Gorvan rock crawler whose species had evolved on a volcanic world. Corporal Ren Tanaka, a lean, quiet man from a place on Earth called Osaka, sat in the testing chair and waited while the technician increased the stimulation level by level. And he showed no visible reaction at 10 or 20 or 30. And at level 40, he raised an eyebrow. And at level 50, the maximum setting, he looked at the technician and asked in a perfectly calm voice if the machine was turned on. The technician stared at him for 11 seconds, and then submitted a formal transfer request to a different department. The fourth evaluation was the psychological stress assessment. Cadets were shown footage of apex predators from various death worlds, the kind of footage that was specifically selected to trigger fear responses in any species with a functional survival instinct. Massive creatures with rows of teeth and armored hides and venomous appendages. The nightmares of 100 different worlds. The Vrith cadets displayed immediate flight responses. The Holovan went dark with fear. The Nessari secreted defensive toxins that required the room to be evacuated. All normal and expected and well-documented reactions. Private Josie Almeida, a young woman from a place called Brazil, with curly hair and bright eyes, watched the footage with her head tilted to one side and pointed at a creature classified as a Category 9 megafauna threat, a six-legged armored predator from the death moon of Krivos that had been known to tear apart light military vehicles. She could pet it. The psychologist administering the test, a Celesi named Orth, asked her to clarify. Almeida said it looked like a big dog, and she liked dogs, and she asked again if she could pet it. Orth ended the test early. That evening, Vorshan called an emergency meeting of the Academy's senior staff in the secure conference chamber deep beneath the main campus. And he stood at the head of the long stone table and looked at the faces of instructors who had collectively trained tens of thousands of cadets across dozens of species, and who now looked back at him with expressions he had never seen on any of them before. Our entire testing framework, Vorshan said, every evaluation, every metric, every baseline, every scale we have developed over 2,000 cycles of operation is built on the assumption that biological life has certain limits, that there is a range within which sentient beings operate, and that our job is to push cadets toward the upper boundaries of that range. He paused and let the silence fill the room. The humans do not exist within that range, he continued. They exist so far beyond it that our tests cannot measure them, our instruments cannot track them, and our staff cannot process what they are seeing. And I want every one of you to understand what that means. He placed both primary hands flat on the table and leaned forward. It means that this academy was not built to train creatures like them. It was built to train creatures to survive creatures like them. And now they are sitting in our mess hall, eating food that would poison half our student body, and laughing about it. And we need to decide what we are going to do about that. The room was very quiet for a very long time. The Crucible was the Academy's most legendary and most feared evaluation, a midterm survival exercise that had been conducted every cycle for nearly 2,000 years, and it had broken more cadets than any classroom or laboratory ever could, because it stripped away every comfort and every safety net, and left nothing but a hostile world and the question of whether you were strong enough to keep breathing on it. The rules were straightforward. Mixed species teams of 6 cadets were dropped onto an uninhabited world with minimal gear and told to survive for 10 standard cycles, which translated to roughly 15 Earth days. And then a shuttle would come to collect whoever was still alive. The average survival rate across the Academy's long history was 96%, which sounded high until you did the math and realized that 4 out of every 100 cadets who went into the Crucible did not come back, and that over 2,000 years, those numbers added up to a memorial wall in the Academy's main hall that stretched from floor to ceiling and was covered in names. Vorshan had decided to embed 1 human in each of the 6 mixed-species teams, rather than keeping the humans together, partly because he wanted to observe them under real field stress, and partly because something in the back of his brain told him that putting all 6 humans on the same team would be less of a survival exercise and more of a conquest. Sergeant Okafor's team was designated Team 4, and it consisted of Okafor herself, along with a Vrith cadet named Chicket, who was small and fragile, and whose wings trembled when the wind blew too hard. A Holovan cadet named Glassfiend, whose crystalline body was beautiful, but dangerously sensitive to temperature changes. A Nessari cadet named Pelun, who needed constant hydration, or his amphibious skin would begin to crack and bleed. And two young Kethvari cadets named Vorin and Tosh, who were strong, but inexperienced, had never been off-world before. They were dropped on a world called Designation 447, a planet with no proper name, because it had been surveyed once, and then classified as hostile and forgotten. A world of jagged stone valleys and thick toxic vegetation, and temperature swings that could range from freezing to boiling within a single day cycle. And the fauna was the kind that made experienced soldiers check their weapons twice. The shuttle left them on a flat ridge with 2 days of emergency rations and a basic medical kit, and a signal beacon for extraction in case of critical emergency, and nothing else. Okafor watched the shuttle disappear into the gray sky, and then turned to her team and smiled, and said that this looked like a nice place, and that they should find water before dark. The other 5 stared at her, as if she had lost her mind. But she was already moving. Within the first 3 hours, Okafor had identified a sheltered overhang in the rock face. That would protect them from temperature swings. She had tested the local vegetation by rubbing small amounts on her inner arm, and waiting to see what caused a reaction and what did not. And she had set up a simple rainwater collection system using the emergency tarp from the medical kit. Shikit asked her how she knew how to do all of this, and Okafor said that on Earth, these were things children learned in a youth organization called the Scouts. And Shikit asked at what age human children learned wilderness survival, and Okafor said around 7 or 8. And Shikit's wings went so flat against his body that he looked like he was trying to disappear. By the end of the first day, Okafor had a fire going, which terrified Glassfiend, until Okafor explained that it would regulate the temperature around their shelter and keep nocturnal predators away. And she had organized a watch rotation so that someone was always alert, and she had fashioned a crude spear from a straight branch and a sharpened stone that she had napped by striking rocks together in a way that Tosh said looked practiced and ancient. On the 3rd day, the crisis came. Pelun was dehydrating. His skin had begun to crack along his forearms, and his breathing had turned shallow and labored. And the small amount of collected rainwater was not enough to sustain his aquatic biology. And the nearest real water source that their scanner could detect was an underground stream that surfaced in a canyon 2 kilometers to the east. The canyon was infested with swarmer-class fauna, small, fast, venomous creatures that hunted in packs of 30 or more, and that had mandibles capable of shearing through light body armor. And their venom was a neurotoxin that could paralyze a Kethvari in under a minute. Vorin said flatly that crossing the canyon was suicide. Tosh agreed. Glassfiend said nothing, but dimmed to almost dark, which was the Holovan way of saying they were. Terrified, Shikit calculated the odds on his datapad and announced that the probability of successfully crossing the canyon and returning alive was approximately 11%. Okafor looked at Pelun, who was lying on his side with his eyes half closed, and she asked Shikit how long Pelun had without water. Shikit said 2 days at most. Okafor picked up her spear and the empty water containers and said she was going and that nobody else needed to come. Vorin told her it was an 11% chance. Okafor told Vorin that 11% was not 0 and walked into the gathering dark. She crossed the canyon at night because the swarmers were slightly less active in the cold, and she moved low and quiet through the jagged rocks with nothing but her sharpened stick and the stones she had collected in her pockets. And 3 times the swarmers found her, and 3 times she fought them off, swinging her spear in wide arcs and using the rocks as thrown weapons and taking bites on her arms and legs that bled freely, but did not stop her, because human blood clotted fast, and human muscles did not stop working just because they were damaged. She reached the water source and filled every container she had, and then she turned around and crossed the canyon again, bleeding from 7 different wounds, and she walked back into camp just before dawn and set the water containers down next to Peiluun and began treating her own injuries with a needle and thread from the medical kit, and a paste she had made from crushing local plants that she believed might have antiseptic properties. Chickett watched her sew her own wounds shut without any pain medication and with hands that did not shake, and he asked her how she had known the plant paste would work as a disinfectant. Okafor shrugged and said she did not know for certain, that she had guessed based on the plant's smell and texture, and that she had figured a 70% chance of it working was better than a 100% chance of Peiluun dying. Peiluun drank the water, and by the next morning his skin had begun to heal, and his breathing was steady, and he looked at Okafor with his large, dark amphibian eyes, and said nothing, because there were no words in his language or any language for what he was feeling. The remaining days passed, and Okafor kept them all alive through a sandstorm, and a temperature plunge, and an encounter with a large predator that she drove off by making herself look bigger and screaming at it until it decided that whatever she was, it was not worth the trouble. On extraction day, the shuttle landed, and all 6 members of Team 4 walked aboard, alive and intact. Across all 6 teams, the results were the same. Every single team with an embedded human survived with 0 casualties, not one lost member, not one critical injury that was not treated and healed in the field. Teams without humans suffered the standard 4% loss rate. When the data was compiled and placed on Vorshan's desk, he stared at it for a very long time, and then he called Tivan into his office and showed it to her. She read it twice, and her feathered crest rose and fell and rose again. "This is not a statistical anomaly," she said. "No," Vorshan agreed. "This is not luck." "No." Tivan set the report down and looked at him with her sharp avian eyes. "Then what is it?" she asked. Vorshan thought about Okafor walking alone into a canyon full of venomous predators in the dark, with a pointed stick and a pocket full of rocks for a teammate she had known for 3 days. He said quietly that he did not have a word for it yet, but that he was beginning to understand why everything on their planet had lost. In the weeks after the Crucible, the Academy changed in ways that were difficult to name but impossible to ignore. The human cadets had become legends on campus. Stories about them passed from species to species in the mess hall and the training yards and the dormitory corridors, growing larger and stranger with each telling. And the stories were always told in the same hushed tones that every culture in the galaxy reserved for things that were sacred, or things that were terrifying, or things that were somehow both at the same time. But alongside the legend came the fear. Cadets began avoiding the corridors when the humans walked through them. Conversations stopped when a human entered the mess hall. Study groups dissolved when one of the 6 sat down at a nearby table. And the humans noticed because they were not stupid. And Vorshan could see that it bothered them, even though they tried not to show it. Corporal Tanaka ate alone for 4 days in a row before Private Almeida dragged him back to a main table and told him that if the galaxy was going to be afraid of them, it could at least be afraid of them together. Liaison Officer Tivan saw what was happening and decided that the only way to fix it was to face it directly, because fear that lived in silence only grew larger. And so she organized a cross-species cultural seminar in the Academy's Great Hall and asked Sergeant Okafor to give a presentation on human history and survival. Okafor agreed on the condition that she could do it her way, and Tivan said yes, because she had learned by now that telling a human they could not do something their way was a waste of everyone's time. The Great Hall was full on the evening of the seminar, every seat taken, cadets from dozens of species packed into the tiered amphitheater that had been built to hold 1,000. And the air was thick with the chemical traces of anxiety from a dozen different biologies, the sharp tang of Rith, stress hormones, the ozone smell of Halavan fear response, the wet musk of Nesseri defensive secretions. Okafor walked to the center of the floor, a small woman in a standard Academy uniform, standing alone in the middle of a vast stone circle, surrounded by aliens who were afraid of her. And she looked up at them and smiled the way she always smiled, warm and easy and a little bit crooked. And she said hello, and told them she wanted to tell them about where she came from. She started with the planet. She told them about Earth, and she did not soften it or make it sound beautiful. She told them the truth, that it was a world of fire and ice and poison and teeth, a world where the ground itself could shake apart and swallow cities whole, where mountains could explode and block out the sun for years, where the climate could swing from tropical heat to frozen wasteland in the span of a few thousand years, where the oceans were full of creatures that could swallow you in a single bite, and the land was full of creatures that could run you down, or crush you, or inject you with venom that dissolved your organs from the inside. She told them that life on Earth had been nearly wiped out 5 times, 5 mass extinction events that had killed almost everything, and that the most recent one had been caused by a rock falling from space that hit the planet so hard it set the atmosphere on fire. The audience was very still. Then she told them about humans. She told them that her species had started as small, weak animals on a continent called Africa. Animals with no claws and no armor and no venom. Animals that should not have survived a single generation on that terrible world. But they did survive because they could do 2 things that nothing else on the planet could do as well. They could run for longer than anything alive, and they could think about tomorrow. She told them that humans had chased animals across open grasslands for hours and hours until the animals collapsed from exhaustion, because humans could sweat and cool themselves while running, and almost nothing else could, and that this was how her ancestors had hunted, not with strength or speed, but with the simple, terrifying refusal to stop following. She told them that humans had walked out of Africa with stone tools and leather wraps and nothing else, and had spread across the entire planet, across deserts and mountains and frozen tundra and open ocean, and that they had done this not because they were built for those places, but because they looked at a place that would kill them and decided to go there anyway. She told them about the ocean crossings, how humans had built boats out of wood and cloth, and crossed thousands of kilometers of open water, with no maps and no certainty of land on the other side, guided by stars and wind and stubbornness, and how many of those boats never arrived, and the humans kept building more, and kept keeping sailing. She told them about the space program, how humans had strapped themselves to controlled explosions, and launched themselves off the planet, in metal tubes held together with rivets and math, and had landed on their own moon, and walked on it, and come home, and that the computers guiding them had less processing power than the datapad Chicket used to calculate survival odds. Several cadets left the hall during this portion of the talk, their instinctive fear responses overwhelming their ability to sit still, and nobody stopped them because nobody blamed them. But Okafor was not finished. She paused, and her smile faded, and her voice changed and became quieter, and the hall went so silent that Vorshan could hear the ventilation system humming 3 floors above. She told them about why. She said that everything she had described, the running and the walking and the sailing and the building, none of it was possible because humans were tough. Because there were plenty of things in the galaxy that were tougher than humans, and she had met some of them right here at this academy. It was possible because humans refused to stop, and they refused to stop not for themselves, but for each other. She told them about mothers who had lifted vehicles off their trapped children with nothing but their bare hands, and the chemical explosion of love in their bloodstream. About soldiers who had carried wounded friends for kilometers under enemy fire, because leaving someone behind was worse than dying. About doctors who had worked until they collapsed during plagues because every patient was someone's child or parent or friend. About people who had planted trees knowing they would never live long enough to sit in their shade because they wanted their grandchildren to have shade. She told them that the thing most species saw when they looked at humans was the endurance and the pain tolerance and the recklessness and the refusal to stay down. All of that was just the surface, just the machinery, and that underneath the machinery was something much simpler and much more frightening. Humans were not hard to kill because they were strong. Humans were hard to kill because they had someone to come home to, or someone to protect, or someone to avenge, or simply someone who they had decided was theirs. And once a human decided you were theirs, they would walk through fire and poison and vacuum and time itself to keep you safe, and there was no force in the galaxy that could talk them out of it. The hall was completely silent. Vorshan stood at the back wall, with all 8 of his limbs pressed flat against the stone behind him, and he felt something shift inside his understanding of these small, soft, impossible creatures. Something fundamental, like a gear clicking into place that changed the direction of every mechanism it was connected to. He had been wrong about them. Were frightening because of what they could endure, because of their death-world biology and their impossible pain tolerance and their absurd chemical resistances. And all of that was true, but it was not the thing that made them dangerous. The thing that made them dangerous was that every ounce of that terrible endurance was fueled by love. Not the soft, gentle love that poets wrote about on safe worlds with mild climates and no predators, but the fierce, burning love of creatures who had evolved in a place where everything they cared about could be taken from them at any moment. The love of beings who knew what loss was and had decided that they would break the laws of biology and physics and reason before they would let it happen again. That was what the other species felt when the humans walked into a room. Not the presence of a predator, but the presence of something that had chosen to fight the entire universe for the things it loved. Fight for 300,000 years. After the talk, the hall emptied slowly and quietly, and Vorshan noticed that the cadets who left were not walking away from the humans anymore. They were walking beside them. Paluin, the Nessari cadet whose life Okafor had saved in the canyon, approached her as she was gathering her notes, and he stood before her with his large dark eyes glistening with moisture that was not from dehydration, and he told her that he had been afraid of her since the day she arrived. Okafor looked up at him and asked if he was still afraid. Paluin was quiet for a moment, and then he said yes, more than ever, but that now he was grateful for it, because he understood that her strength was not a threat to him, it was a shield around him, and he had never had a shield before. Okafor reached out and put her hand on his damp shoulder, and said nothing, because sometimes humans did not need words. 6 months had passed since the 6 humans had walked off a transport shuttle onto the frozen landing platform of the Galactic Survival Academy on Vereth Co. And in that time, the Academy had changed more than it had in the previous 500 cycles combined. Not in its buildings, or its equipment, or its curriculum, though all of those had been adjusted, but in something deeper and harder to name. Something in the way the cadets moved through the corridors and sat together in the mess hall, and looked at each other during training exercises. Something in the air itself, as if a door had been opened somewhere, and a wind from a world that smelled like sweat and iron and stubborn hope had blown through, and rearranged everything it touched. The Grand Convocation was the Academy's most formal ceremony, held once per cycle in the Great Hall, where the year's results were announced and graduating cadets received their commissions, and any institutional changes were formally announced. Declared before an audience of galactic delegates and military officials and representatives from every species that had ever sent a cadet through the Academy's gates. The Great Hall was full beyond capacity, delegates standing along the walls and crowding the upper galleries, because word had spread across the connected worlds that something unprecedented was going to happen at this particular convocation, and everyone wanted to see it. Vorshan stood at the central podium, his 8 limbs arranged in the formal Kethvari posture of authority, his 4 eyes scanning the vast crowd, and he felt the weight of 2,000 years of tradition pressing down on his shoulders like gravity from a heavier world. He began with the graduating class. All 6 human cadets had passed with the highest marks in Academy history, not just in survival and endurance, but in teamwork, adaptability, crisis leadership, and a category that had never existed before this cycle, that the faculty had created specifically because the humans demonstrated a quality that the existing framework had no way to measure. They had called it bonded perseverance, defined as the measurable increase in survival capability that occurred when a cadet formed a protective attachment to teammates and channeled their survival instinct outward rather than inward. The humans had broken the scale on this metric so thoroughly that the faculty had simply recorded their scores as beyond measurement and moved on. Vorshan called the 6 humans forward, and they walked to the center of the Great Hall in their dress uniforms. Sergeant Okafor at the front with her easy stride and her crooked smile and the faint scars on her forearms from the swarmer bites she had taken in the canyon on designation 447. And behind her, Corporal Tanaka and Private Almeida and the others, and they stood in a loose, comfortable line that was not quite military formation, but was somehow more impressive because it looked like 6 people who simply knew where they belonged in relation to each other without being told. The hall was silent as Vorshan placed the Academy's silver commendation on each of their chests. And when he reached Okafor, she looked up at him and said quietly that it had been an honor, and he looked down at her and said with equal quiet that the honor was not hers. Then he returned to the podium and gripped its edges with his primary hands and told the assembled galaxy that he had an announcement that would alter the fundamental doctrine of the Academy. A murmur moved through the crowd like wind through tall grass. Vorshan explained that the Academy's survival doctrine had remained unchanged for nearly 2,000 cycles, that it had been written by the founders and refined by generations of instructors and tested against the hard reality of a hostile universe, and that it had served well, and that it was wrong. The murmur became a rumble. He recited the old doctrine from memory, because every instructor knew it the way they knew their own name. Survival is the mastery of environment, the conservation of energy, and the avoidance of unnecessary risk. He let the words hang in the air for a moment, familiar and solid and reasonable, the words that had guided tens of thousands of cadets across hundreds of worlds, and then he said that 6 humans from a death world called Earth had walked into his academy 6 months ago and shown him that reasonable was not enough. He told them about the intake tests, and how the humans had shattered every baseline, about the Crucible, and how every team with an embedded human had achieved 0 casualties, while teams without humans suffered the standard loss rate. About Okafor, crossing a canyon of venomous predators alone in the dark for a teammate she had known for 3 days. About the cultural seminar where a small woman had stood in the center of this very hall, and explained to 1,000 terrified aliens that the secret to human survival was not strength, but love. He told them that for 2,000 years, the Academy had taught cadets to survive as individuals, to calculate odds, minimize exposure, conserve resources, and preserve the self, and that this approach had produced a 96% survival rate, which meant that 4% of cadets died, which meant that over 2 millennia, the memorial wall in the main corridor had accumulated thousands of names of young beings who had followed the doctrine perfectly and died anyway, because the doctrine was built on a lie. The lie was that survival was an individual act. The humans had shown him that it was not. He unfolded a document and read the new doctrine, and his voice carried through the great hall and through the broadcast systems to every connected world in the galaxy. Survival is the refusal to abandon those beside you, the willingness to adapt beyond your limits, and the conviction that no situation is beyond recovery. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Vorshan had ever heard. He looked out at the faces in the crowd, hundreds of species from hundreds of worlds, beings of crystal and chitin and scale and fur and membrane and light, all of them staring at him, and he said that the old doctrine had asked cadets to survive alone, and that the new doctrine asked them to survive together, and that the difference between those two things was the difference between a 96% survival rate and a 100% survival rate. And that difference was not a number. It was a name. It was every name on that memorial wall. It was every cadet who had died alone on a hostile world because nobody came back for them. He said that the humans came back. He said that was what made them frightening, and that was what the galaxy needed to learn. The first to stand was Chikit, the small Vrith cadet, with the trembling wings, who had calculated Okafor's odds at 11% in the canyon. And he rose from his seat and extended his wings fully, which was the highest honor his species could give, and his wings did not tremble at all. Then Peluin stood, the Nesseri whose life had been saved by river water carried through a canyon of death, and he pressed both webbed hands over his chest in the Nesseri gesture of bond debt, a debt that could never be repaid and was never meant to be. Then Glasveen stood, and Vorin, and Tosh, and the other cadets who had trained alongside the humans, and then the cadets who had only heard the stories, and then the instructors, and then the delegates, row by row and tier by tier, until the entire Great Hall was standing. It was the first standing ovation in the Academy's 2,000-year history, and the species who started it did not have a cultural tradition of standing ovations. They had learned it from the humans, because humans stood up when something mattered, and the galaxy had decided that this mattered. Okafor and the 5 other humans stood at the center of the hall and watched 1,000 aliens rise to their feet for them. And Okafor's crooked smile wavered for just a moment, and her eyes shone bright, and she blinked hard once, and then the smile came back stronger than before. Because humans could stare down death worlds and cross canyons full of monsters, but kindness from strangers could break them open in a heartbeat. Later that evening, long after the ceremony had ended, and the great hall had emptied, and the lights had dimmed, Tivon sat alone in her office and composed her final report to the Galactic Council. She had written thousands of reports in her career, detailed analytical documents full of data and recommendations, and carefully hedged language. But this time, she found that she had only one thing to say. She typed a single line and sent it. Do not ask why humans are frightening. Ask what it means that they chose to frighten the galaxy on behalf of everyone in it. She closed her terminal and walked to the window and looked out at the Academy's campus, where the lights were still on in the mess hall, because Okafor and Peluin and Chikit and a dozen other cadets from a dozen different worlds were sitting together, eating food that was too spicy for most of them, and laughing about it. And Tivon watched them for a long time, and felt something warm and strange settle into her chest. Something she suspected the humans had a word for, but that the Celesti language had never needed until now. Within one standard cycle, 12 more survival academies across the galaxy formally requested human instructors, and every request was approved, and within a generation, the galactic survival rate in frontier emergencies doubled, and historians would later call it the human doctrine, the moment the galaxy stopped learning how to survive alone, and started learning how to survive together. And on the frozen moon of Vareth Ko, the memorial wall in the main corridor of the Galactic Survival Academy received no new names for the first time in 2,000 years, and Vorshan stood before it, with all 8 of his limbs at rest, and read the old names one by one, and whispered to them that he was sorry it had taken so long, and that the ones who had taught him how to save everyone else were small and soft and worn, and came from a terrible, beautiful world called Earth. And he hoped that was enough.